They said you could hear the church bells of Millhaven from 10 miles away, soft golden tones that rolled across the plains like a hymn carried by the wind. But on a January night in 1905, the bells rang one last time. Then never again. By morning, the church stood locked, the choir gone, and every clock in town had stopped at 11:47 p.m. No one could explain why. Some said it was an act of God. Others swore it was something far worse, a sound so pure, it drew something dark out of the silence. The town of Millhaven was little more than a handful of houses and one proud steeple rising out of the Dakota plains. It sat where the snow never seemed to melt completely, where the sky stretched so wide it made people feel small. By 1905, it had become known across the territory not for its crops nor for its rail line, but for its sound, the clear, resonant chime of St. Bridget's church bells. The bells were cast in Pennsylvania in 1872 and shipped across the country by wagon. 3 great iron throats that could sing through fog, storm, and blizzard. When they rang, even travelers miles away would stop to listen. They said the bells made the prairie feel alive, as if the vast empty land had found its own voice. The townsfolk believed the bells protected them. No drought ever lasted long, and even the harshest winters seemed to spare Millhaven from true hardship. Old families swore that as long as the bells kept ringing, no misfortune would touch their homes. Weddings, funerals, and Christmas vigils, all of it was marked by their tolling. There was a kind of peace in knowing the rhythm of those sounds, a pattern that carried through every life and generation. At sunset, the final peal would drift out across the plains and you could hear people humming along from their porches, children stopping their play to listen. It was more than sound. It was a heartbeat. Then came the silence. In January 1905, the bells rang for the last time. No one knows exactly why that night began differently, only that it ended with something broken, not just in metal, but in spirit. The snow had fallen thick, muffling every step, every breath. Smoke curled from chimneys as families gathered around fires. It was the kind of night when even the wind seemed to pause. Then faint at first came the bells, deep, deliberate, and slower than usual. Each note rolled out longer than it should have, echoing in the empty cold. People noticed. Lamps were lit, curtains pulled back. Something about the rhythm felt wrong, as though the bells were not being rung by hands but by something unseen. At the parsonage, Reverend Caldwell stepped outside, coat half-buttoned, watching frost rise from his breath as he listened. He would later tell the sheriff that the bells sounded too human, as if they were crying. Then just as suddenly they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Dogs began to bark. Somewhere a baby started crying. The air felt heavy, charged. Across town, clocks began to stutter, then stopped completely, everyone at 11:47 p.m. By morning, the bells were still and cold. When a few brave men climbed the tower to inspect them, they found the ropes shredded and the clappers still swinging faintly, though no wind moved them. After that night, something changed in Millhaven. The sound that had once united the town now haunted it. The people went about their days quietly, almost reverently, as if speaking too loudly might wake something best left asleep. There were stories, of course, that someone had broken into the church, that lightning had struck the tower, that the metal itself had gone mad in the cold. But no explanation held. The blacksmith said the bells were intact, though when he struck one with his hammer it made no sound at all. Not even a dull thud, just silence. Children who once played in the churchyard began to avoid it. Travelers no longer stayed overnight. And every Sunday as the congregation gathered, the absence of that opening chime hung in the air like a ghost. The church still stood proud, its steeple reaching for the pale Dakota sky. But now it seemed less a beacon and more a warning, a hollow reminder of something lost. People whispered that the bells hadn't just stopped ringing. They'd taken the town's voice with them. It was in the early spring of 1904, when the snow had just begun to retreat from the fields, that a stranger arrived in Millhaven. He came by train from the east, stepping down from the platform with a single weathered trunk and a leather case that he kept clutched to his chest. His name was Ernst Kappel, and though he introduced himself simply as a musician, there was something about him that drew attention, not for his manner, which was calm and polite, but for the silence that seemed to follow him. Even the sound of the train's whistle faded strangely in his wake. He had the pale, drawn face of someone who had lived too long among cold stone walls, and eyes that moved as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. Reverend Caldwell, then 50 and respected by all, met him outside the post office. Capel handed over a letter of recommendation, written in an old European hand and stamped with the seal of a seminary in Salzburg. The Reverend, impressed by the credentials, offered him lodging in the church's guest quarters and soon after, a position as choir director. Millhaven had not had proper music in some time. The children's voices had grown uneven, and the bell ringer was aging. The townspeople welcomed the newcomer, curious about his foreign ways. He spoke rarely but carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man who believed he could make even the air obey him. Capel's first rehearsals were simple, almost hesitant. He listened more than he spoke, letting each singer's voice reveal its flaws, but after only a few days something changed. The choir began to sound different. Harmonies that had once faltered now rose and fell like waves. Parishioners remarked that the music seemed to move through the walls of the church, vibrating through the wooden floorboards and into the soil beneath. The Reverend, at first delighted, soon found himself uneasy. Capel's conducting was unorthodox. He used no written music, no hymnals, only strange hand gestures and murmured syllables that no one recognized. When asked, he explained that they were ancient tonal guides, a way to align the human voice with divine frequencies. Few understood him, but the results were undeniable. By midsummer, the reputation of St. Bridget's choir had spread beyond Millhaven. People came from neighboring towns to listen. Some said they felt lighter after hearing the music, as if a burden had been lifted from their hearts. Others described the opposite, an inexplicable sadness, a feeling of being hollowed out. There were moments during the services when Capel would stop conducting and simply stand still, eyes closed, while the choir's voices carried on in perfect unity without him. It was as though the singers were caught in something larger than themselves, as though the music were directing them. Rumors began to circulate that Capel's past was not as pure as his hymns. An old prospector claimed to have seen his name once in a Viennese newspaper, associated with a scandal at a cathedral, where a choir had fallen ill after performing an experimental mass. Another man swore he heard Capel speaking alone in the belfry at night, whispering in a language that sounded more like chanting than prayer. The Reverend dismissed these as gossip, yet his sermons began to grow shorter, his voice weary. He later wrote in his private journal that he feared the songs no longer reached heaven but something deeper. The children in the choir began to have nightmares. They spoke of a tall figure standing beside Capel during practice, one no adult could see. A few quit altogether, trembling as they described how the music sometimes pulled at their throats. Yet the townsfolk kept coming. The church had never been so full. There was pride, but beneath it, unease, the kind that makes a man look over his shoulder even in daylight. As the summer waned, Capel started talking about a final composition, one he said would make the bells sing with the human voice. He smiled when he spoke of it, but his eyes stayed distant, fixed on something beyond the church walls. No one yet knew it, but Millhaven's fate was already written in that unseen score, waiting for the night when silence would learn to speak. By the time autumn arrived, the music inside St. Bridget's had begun to change. It was gradual at first, so subtle that only the most attentive parishioners noticed. The hymns grew slower, the pauses between verses longer, as if the choir were listening for a reply from something beyond the walls. Capel said little about these changes. He moved through rehearsals like a man possessed by purpose, eyes half closed, head tilted as if catching a faint echo only he could hear. His gestures became more fluid, almost ritualistic, a slow sweep of the hand, a finger raised to the ceiling, a hush that fell so deep it made the wooden beams groan. The songs were no longer the familiar psalms or Latin prayers the town had sung for generations. They were something else, darker, older. The notes clung together in unnatural intervals that made the air shimmer with tension. Some described the sound as beautiful but wrong, like a melody played backward. When asked where he had learned such arrangements, Capel only smiled and said, "Music is older than we are. I am only uncovering what has always been there." Reverend Caldwell began to worry. He found Capel one evening in the candlelight, bent over a sheet of parchment covered in strange symbols, circles, geometric patterns, fragments of words written in ink so dark it seemed to absorb the light. When the Reverend asked what he was working on, Capel covered the page and replied, "It's the original notation of the bells, before your church was ever built." Caldwell later confided to his wife that the paper looked more like an invocation than a hymn. The choir members were uneasy too. Several of them complained of headaches after practice, of voices echoing inside their heads long after the last note. A young woman named Sarah Dittman fainted mid-song and awoke murmuring a phrase none could decipher. "Non auditur, non auditur," she whispered again and again until Capel placed his hand on her forehead and she fell silent. The next Sunday she returned to sing as though nothing had happened. Outside the church, the town's mood began to shift. People avoided walking near St. Bridget's after dusk. Farmers reported hearing music drifting over the fields at night, faint but distinct as though carried by a wind that came from underground. Dogs would whine and refuse to approach the bell tower, and yet each Sunday the pews were still full. There was fear, but there was fascination too. The people couldn't turn away from what they were hearing. It was as if the music had taken root in them. By late November, the choir's harmonies had become almost unbearable in their intensity. Parishioners would weep uncontrollably during the Mass, some collapsing before the final verse. The air inside the church seemed to hum, charged with invisible energy that prickled the skin. Reverend Caldwell begged Capel to return to the old hymns, to the safer tones, but Capel refused. "We are on the edge of something divine," he said. "Don't you feel it? The boundary is thinning." There were nights when the Reverend could see the glow of candles burning long past midnight through the stained glass. Sometimes faint voices joined Capel's, chanting, rising, fading again. The next morning the church smelled faintly of iron and rain, though no storm had passed. It was around this time that a traveler passing through Millhaven wrote of hearing unholy harmonies from a distance, music that seemed to rise from the very earth. He described it as neither joyful nor mournful, but ancient, like the voice of time itself, dragged through sorrow. When the first snow fell, Capel unveiled a new composition he called the Gloria of Stillness. He told the choir that it would complete their work, that it would awaken the bells. The sheet music he distributed was indecipherable, not notes, but spirals and lines that crossed like constellations. The singers hesitated, yet when they began, their voices blended perfectly, effortlessly, as if guided by some unseen force. Reverend Caldwell stood in the back pew, trembling. The walls of St. Bridget's seemed to vibrate. The air thickened. The last note hung far too long, and when it finally faded, the silence that followed was not peace. It was expectation. The town would not forget that sound, nor the strange electric stillness that lingered afterward, as though something ancient had just been called by name. By December, Millhaven had grown restless. The church that once united its people now filled them with quiet dread. Every night, faint echoes drifted through the frozen streets, the sound of bells tolling though no one was in the tower, or a low hum that seemed to come from beneath the ground itself. At first, the townsfolk dismissed it as the wind or the creaking of old wood in the cold. But as the weeks passed, more began to hear it, layered whispers, half-melodies, the kind of sounds that made candles flicker and set horses on edge. One night, a farmer named Amos Griggs claimed he heard singing while walking home from the tavern. The church was dark, its doors locked, yet from within came the unmistakable voices of the choir. He swore he recognized their tone, but it was slower, deeper, almost mechanical, like a phonograph winding down. When he pressed his ear to the door, the sound stopped abruptly. The next morning, he found his footprints circling the church 3 times, though he remembered walking straight home. Others began to speak of strange things too. Clara Jennings, the widow who lived across from St. Bridget's, told her neighbors she saw figures moving behind the stained glass windows at midnight, their silhouettes bending unnaturally, swaying to a rhythm she could not hear. Children complained of being woken by faint bells that no one else seemed to notice. In one account, written later by the town's blacksmith, he described how his workshop clock stopped at exactly 11:47 every night, restarting only when the sun rose. Reverend Caldwell, already strained by Capel's growing influence, tried to reason with the people. "The Lord tests us in many ways," he said during his final sermon that winter. "But we must not let fear make us imagine what is not there." Yet even he was not immune. He confided to his diary that he had begun to hear breathing inside the confessional when he was alone. a slow exhale that came between his own words. The choir itself seemed caught in a kind of trance. Members spoke less, their eyes distant, their expressions vacant between songs. When one of them, young Henry Lane, tried to quit, Capel paid him a visit at home. The boy's mother later said she overheard their conversation, a calm voice, then a long silence, and finally Capel saying, "You've already given your voice. It belongs to the song now." Henry returned to practice the next day, pale and trembling. The strange occurrences began to blur the boundary between rumor and reality. Lamps flickered without cause. Animals refused to cross the churchyard, and the air around St. Bridget's always seemed colder than the rest of town. People began avoiding eye contact when the subject came up. They wanted to believe it was nothing, but deep down they all felt it, an invisible vibration that made the ground seem alive beneath their boots. Then came the night the bells rang without sound. Dozens of witnesses saw the ropes moving through the frosted windows, the great iron bells swinging violently, but not a single note escaped them. Only a deep, suffocating silence pressed against the walls of the town. It was as though all noise and the wind, the dogs, even the crack of the hearths, had been swallowed whole. The silence lasted less than a minute, but when it lifted, several people collapsed in the snow, their ears bleeding faintly. From that night onward, no one doubted something unnatural had taken hold. Some whispered that Capel had found the perfect frequency, a harmony that touched what no human ear was meant to hear. Others said the church itself had begun to sing, and that the human voices inside were only echoes now. Whatever it was, Millhaven could feel it. The air, once filled with music, now seemed to pulse with the memory of it, an unending echo of something that had not yet finished speaking. The night of January 12, 1905 began like any other in Millhaven, bitterly cold, with the snow settling deep and heavy on the roofs. A full moon hung low, hazy through the frost, casting a silver glow over the empty streets. The wind had died down to nothing, leaving the town trapped in a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Inside the homes, scattered across the prairie, families gathered around fires, unaware that before dawn, Millhaven would lose more than its warmth. It would lose its sound. Shortly before midnight, faint lights were seen flickering through the stained glass windows of St. Bridget's. A few residents, curious but wary, stepped out to look. The church doors had been locked earlier that evening, yet the bell tower was lit from within, glowing with a strange amber hue. Then came the first toll, deep, deliberate, and painfully slow. The bells hadn't rung in weeks, and their return should have brought comfort. But the sound that night was different. It was heavy, discordant, as if the metal itself were straining against something unseen. One by one, people began to gather outside. They stood in the snow, clutching their coats, breath fogging in the cold. Through the frosted windows, they could see movement. Figures inside the church, silhouettes swaying in time with the sound. Someone whispered that the choir must have returned. Another said they could see Capel standing at the altar, his arms outstretched. Then the second toll came, louder than before, and then a third. Soon the bells rang in perfect sequence, 12 times, slow and deliberate, until even the air seemed to shake. Then the singing began. It was unlike any hymn the town had ever heard. The voices rose together in eerie, winding tones that made the ground tremble. Some called it beautiful. Others said it felt like being buried alive in sound. Men fell to their knees, clutching their heads. Women wept openly. One witness years later described it as the sound of heaven collapsing. The melody rose higher and higher, reaching a pitch that made the windows rattle and the snow vibrate like liquid. And then just as suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. For nearly a full minute, not a breath of wind stirred. No one moved. Then from within the church came a single human scream, long, raw, and abruptly cut off. The doors shuddered once as if struck from the inside, then fell still. Someone ran forward to open them, but they were bolted tight. When the sheriff arrived with 2 deputies, they forced the doors open. The hinges shrieked. The first thing they noticed was the heat. The air inside was thick and warm, heavy with the scent of iron and wax. The church was empty. Every pew was overturned. Candles burned to the base and sheet music littered the floor. The choir's robes lay neatly folded by the altar, as though left there on purpose. The bells above were motionless. The only sign of life was the faint echo of footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere. fading into the rafters. The clock on the wall had stopped at 11:47 p.m. Reverend Caldwell's Bible was found open at the pulpit, a verse underlined in trembling ink. And there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Capel's conducting baton lay beside it, snapped clean in half. In the following days, search parties scoured the countryside. They found no footprints in the snow, no trail of escape, no sign that anyone had left the church that night. The choir, the reverend, and Capel had simply vanished. The only thing that remained was a faint ringing that seemed to drift from the bell tower whenever the wind blew. For months, no one entered St. Bridget's again. The sheriff ordered the doors sealed. The town stopped holding services, and some families packed up and left altogether. Those who stayed reported strange dreams, of voices calling their names from across the plains, of bells that rang in their sleep. And though no one could prove what happened that night, every person in Millhaven knew one thing with certainty. Something inside that church had been summoned, and it had answered. When the doors of St. Bridget's were finally sealed, the town of Millhaven seemed to exhale for the first time in weeks. Yet the silence that followed was not peace, it was absence. The choir's disappearance left a wound that never healed. At first, people clung to rational explanations. Perhaps they fled, perhaps they perished in the storm, perhaps they'd been taken by the river that ran half a mile from the church. But those theories collapsed under the simplest question: how could 21 people vanish without a single footprint in the snow? The ground had been untouched, smooth as glass, as if the world itself had refused to remember them. In the weeks that followed, the sheriff tried to keep order. He led search parties into the frozen hills, questioning anyone who might have seen or heard something. But each search ended the same way, with silence, confusion, and growing fear. A few men who entered the church after it was sealed claimed they still heard faint music drifting from the walls. One swore he felt the floorboards vibrating beneath his boots, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Another said the bells above moved on their own, though the air inside was perfectly still. The sheriff ordered the tower locked for good, and no one protested. Reverend Caldwell's wife Ruth became one of the first to leave Millhaven. She sold their house for a handful of dollars and boarded a train east. Before she left, she confided to her neighbor that she no longer dreamed in silence. She dreamed of voices whispering through the snow, always singing the same phrase over and over: non-auditor, non-auditor. She didn't know what it meant, but she believed her husband was still singing it somewhere, far beyond the reach of prayer. The town itself began to change. Crops withered early that spring despite good soil and rain. The river froze in mid-April, and the local school closed after the children refused to walk past the churchyard. Those who remained in Millhaven lived as though under a spell, speaking softly, keeping their windows shuttered at night, pretending not to hear the faint tolling that sometimes carried through the fog at dusk. Visitors from neighboring towns started arriving, drawn by curiosity. They came to see the church that swallowed its choir. Some even stayed the night, hoping to witness something. A few did. One man from Bismarck reported that while camping near the church, he woke to the sound of bells tolling from beneath the ground. Another described a soft humming in the air, the same rhythm repeating every 13 seconds, perfectly steady, like the breath of a sleeping creature. By the summer of 1906, Millhaven was nearly deserted. Those who stayed avoided talking about St. Bridget's at all. Grass grew high around the churchyard fence, and birds no longer nested in its eaves. The once beautiful stained glass windows began to blacken from within, the colors fading into gray. People said if you stood close enough to the wood, you could feel a faint vibration as though the music was still trapped inside, endlessly looping through the walls. In 1910, a traveling priest from Minnesota stopped in Millhaven and offered to reconsecrate the church. Against the townspeople's advice, he entered alone. He was inside for nearly 2 hours before emerging pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what he'd seen. His only comment, recorded later in a letter, was that the air inside sounded alive. After that, no one tried again. The church stood untouched for decades, a monument to something no one could name. Its doors sagged with rot. Its steeple leaned with age. But even as the wood decayed, no snow ever gathered on its roof. Travelers who passed by swore they could still hear faint voices when the wind died. Not words, just tones, weaving through the air like a forgotten hymn. The bells themselves never rang again. But on certain nights when the moon hung low and the town was utterly still, a thin shimmer of sound would ripple across the fields, too faint to record, too precise to mistake. It was not the sound of wind or metal or faith. It was the echo of that night, the moment Millhaven's song crossed into silence and never found its way back. When the new century began, Millhaven had already become a whisper, a name passed between travelers with the same quiet fascination as a curse. By 1924, the town's population had dwindled to less than 40. Most of the houses were boarded up, and weeds had overtaken the cobblestone streets. The church, though half collapsed, still stood like a black tooth against the horizon. No one lived within a mile of it, yet sometimes smoke could be seen rising from its courtyard, thin and gray, as if someone inside was keeping a fire that refused to die. That winter, a photographer named Walter Ellison came to Millhaven. He worked for a Boston newspaper that specialized in documenting forgotten towns. His editor sent him after hearing rumors that Millhaven was still singing. The phrase caught his attention. He had covered ghost stories before, but none that felt this specific, this deliberate. When he arrived, he found only 2 families remaining, both too wary to speak at length. They told him not to go near St. Bridget's after sundown. One woman, old and nearly blind, muttered that, "The choir still answers if you call the name wrong." Ellison didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in stories that sold. He pitched his tent near the edge of the town, close enough to photograph the church at sunrise. On his second night, he set up his tripod and opened the camera shutter for a long exposure. The moonlight was sharp and the snow on the ground reflected it like glass. Through the lens, the church looked skeletal, its roof half-caved, its bell tower leaning like a man in prayer. But when he developed the plate later, his hands began to tremble. The photograph showed faint figures standing in the doorway, 21 of them, blurred but distinctly arranged in rows, as though posing for a portrait. Their faces were pale smudges, eyes like hollow pits of light. The strangest part was the shadow that stretched behind them. It wasn't the shape of the church or the moon. It was circular, rippling outward like a sound captured in visible form. Ellison thought it was a chemical flaw at first. He cleaned his lenses, adjusted his plates, and took another photo the next night. This time he left his camera running for 10 minutes and watched from a distance. When he approached to retrieve it, he heard something faint, a hum, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the frozen air. It was coming from beneath the ground, from the direction of the church. He stayed awake until dawn, studying the new plate by lantern light. Again, the same blurred figures appeared, but this time one stood apart from the rest, a man near the front, his hand raised slightly, as though caught mid-gesture. On his, chest faintly visible, was the outline of a small metal cross. Ellison compared it to older photographs of Reverend Caldwell. The resemblance was unmistakable. He packed up his equipment and left the next morning, unable to explain what he had captured. Weeks later, the Boston newspaper published one of his images under the headline, "The Frozen Choir of Millhaven." Readers dismissed it as trick photography, but the photo gained a quiet following among those drawn to the macabre. What the public didn't know was that Ellison had taken 3 plates that night, and only 2 survived. The third was found shattered in his bag, the glass fractured into perfect concentric circles. In his final notes, discovered after his death in 1931, Ellison wrote of hearing the hum again in his dreams. The same steady rhythm, 13 seconds apart, never fading, never stopping. He claimed that if he focused hard enough, he could almost hear words forming beneath the sound. He never wrote what those words were, but one corner of his notebook carried a faint graphite sketch. The outline of a bell, split down the middle, with something dark spilling from its center like smoke. In later decades, Millhaven vanished from most maps. The church fell completely in the storm of '38, and what little remained of the town was reclaimed by the forest. Yet every few years, someone would stumble upon an old photograph in an attic or museum archive, black and white, grainy, unmistakably eerie. In it, the faint silhouette still stood in the doorway of a ruined church, forever caught between silence and song. What do you think really happened in Millhaven that winter night? Was it guilt that made the bells fall silent? Or something older, something the town could never bury? If those voices were still echoing beneath the snow, would you dare to listen? These are the questions that linger long after the story ends. Because some towns don't die. They wait. If you felt the chill of Millhaven tonight, subscribe for more forgotten histories that were never meant to be remembered. And tell us in the comments, do you believe the bells truly stopped ringing? Or are they still ringing for those who know where to listen? Your thoughts might uncover what history chose to forget.